wasting time, our next session is on assessing the VC and AI landscape in Africa. It's a presentation that's going to be done by Michael Strain. So without wasting time, Michael, please come on stage. Can we clap for him, please?
Good afternoon, everybody. So, PE and VC landscape in Africa, opportunities and challenges. And I think the AI bit might have just sneaked in the last couple of days, Giovanni. I don't know. But for those of you who don't know me, I'm an M&A and private equity lawyer covering East Africa, but based here in Dar. And before I kind of launch into the main presentation, I thought it might be good to put PE and VC to one side and really have a think about what are the challenge, or what is the big challenge and opportunity that we're thinking about. And for me, you know, for the markets on the continent, I think there is one particular big challenge, and that's wrapped up as an opportunity all at the same time. So when I opened last year's Private Equity in Tanzania conference, I asked people that if they would remember just one number from the day, that it should be the number 300. And that is 300 million being the predicted population of Tanzania in just 80 years' time. So quite a phenomenal number. And you know, when you take a even further step back and look at the African continent as a whole, we're talking about a population of 4.1 billion people, being a third of humanity. So a bit fiddly with the notes today. So I think the challenge facing East Africa, and indeed the continent as a whole, is how do you grow and develop economies that are going to adequately sustain populations of such magnitude? And of course, as we said, the flip side is mega opportunity. The question is, how do we make this happen, and how should it be happening differently in a private equity and venture capital context? Now, the key element to facilitate growth is access to capital. The fascinating thing about East Africa is the problem is not one of money. So there is absolutely no shortage of money. And in fact, there's actually more capital allocated for investment in East Africa, particularly in Tanzania, than can simply find a home. And that says to me that we simply aren't trying hard enough. When I sit down, we were sitting down over the last couple of days and having a think, I think there are a few key problems with PE and VC in Africa, and I will say particularly East Africa. I think the first one is that it isn't actually really private equity at all in the kind of generally accepted sense of the word. A very significant amount of the money raised for PE on the continent, particularly here in East Africa, comes from the development finance institutions. So in many ways, private equity really is just another form of development finance. So I wonder if people might benefit from thinking about it a bit more like that, because I've come to, probably as lots of you have, lots and lots of conferences, and everyone's very focused on achieving exits, you know, what's your rate of return, you know, getting the cash out as quickly as possible. And yes, of course, that's a good thing, but it isn't quite, it isn't the full kind of spectrum of what I think we should be thinking about in the context of East Africa. Am I going to be able to do it without dropping any on the floor? I don't know. Building on that point, given the nature of the economies that we're talking about, you know, the exit opportunities simply aren't there either. And, you know, exiting to another DFI-backed fund, in my opinion, doesn't count. So the very essence of classic private equity, you know, where you deploy your capital, you affect change, you build the business for exiting at kind of vast return in approximately 5 years, it just doesn't really work. And if we look, I think, at what ultimately development finance institutions' objectives are and what they're trying to achieve, then, frankly, in my opinion, this money should be staying in place for a much longer period of time. So, that leads us to the conclusion that patient capital is likely to yield much more positive results, thus giving companies the time to grow alongside the huge economic growth opportunities, rather than trying to rush things because a particular fund needs to be wound up after 5 or even 7 years. I also often hear people talking about the missing middle in the context of investing in Africa. For me, actually, the key missing element is early stage funding. And I know there are lots of people looking at this, but I still think there's way, way, way more that needs to be done, particularly here in Tanzania. And as I'm sure lots of entrepreneurs that are here today will attest to, it is, despite all the good stuff that's being done, it's really, really, really hard, virtually impossible to raise any money within the first 2 or 3 years of operations. And as we know, those are the most challenging times to run a business. So effectively leaves us in a position where we have a lack of finance for early stage, which in turn leads to an increased failure rate for startups, which then leads to a lack of investable companies, hence all the money raised can't find a home. So actually, if you join the dots, all of these points are linked. So we ask the question, how do we create this pipeline? So again, in my humble opinion, I think there needs to be a reallocation of capital, and this is capital that can't be invested away from private equity and directed much more towards early stage and startups. And frankly, it needs to be done in a way that actually prioritizes getting cash out the door and into businesses as quickly as possible, which kind of neatly brings me on to my next point, which is, the time frame for getting deals done. And I have to say that it just takes far too long. And this is, people will talk about the markets that they're operating in, but I can tell you that it is just as much the fault of the DFI or the DFI-backed fund that things take so long. I've seen promoters of businesses hanging around for a year or so waiting to raise money. And that just doesn't work commercially. I know it's risky, I know it's difficult, but there is far too much procrastination. And in my opinion, delays just shouldn't be tolerated. There needs to be a change of mindset. And that, once commercial terms for a deal are agreed, the deal should be signed within a matter of days, not months. And, I think it's a change of view for everyone, really. I also think PE funds vastly underestimate the importance of having an on-the-ground presence. In my opinion, again, I just don't think you can successfully build a Tanzania or Ethiopia investment portfolio from Nairobi or, God forbid, even Joburg, Dubai, or London. Relationships and community, are so important in these markets, particularly here. And that's why, lots and lots of people have not made the inroads that they could have done because they haven't invested in having people on the ground. Although we do have, the shining examples of people such as Co and DAB Equity, of course, who, they've been able to make really good progress, do a lot of deals by actually having senior reps and decision makers here. So, in conclusion, I'm not saying that PE in Africa doesn't work and has not been a positive force of development. Of course it has. But I don't think we should just have more of the same. I think with more patient capital, more funding for early stage, which will in turn then build pipeline, with less procrastination, quicker deals, and funds genuinely investing in having that on-the-ground presence, then I think that we have a scope to make a kind of very good thing much, much better. So not meant too critically, but I do think that there are changes that should be looked at and implemented for PE in East Africa.